Welcome back, AP World students. Today you are going to look at developments in East Asia and also developments in Dar al-Islam. These are two sections that are really important to know to have a foundation of. We're going to just kind of review what we've learned a little bit about them as they developed before the early modern period, before the year 1200. And then we're just going to kind of summarize what you should be seeing in your readings, explain a little bit more about that from the early modern period, which is where our history class really is going to take off from 1200 to 1450 Common Era. So with that, let's get started. We're going to look at East Asia first. With East Asia, we're mostly looking at China. We do also include Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, but China is going to be kind of the biggest focus, just because if you think back to River Valley civilizations, that's where you start to have some of like the earliest patterns that are going to spread out. So really quick, when we look at East Asia before the year 1200, so if we look at ancient China, if we look at classical China, you have all of these different dynasties. The first time period that we look at is called the Zhou, which is the era of warring states. During this time period, everybody was divided into different groups. Everybody was fighting. There was no central government. And local rulers were essentially noble families that used their own armies to fight each other. Eventually what's going to happen is that the Qin family wins, and so they actually take over and create the next dynasty that is called the Qin dynasty. The Qin dynasty is the one that you've learned about with the emperor who unifies all these regions into one China for the first time. So if you think Qin, think China. And he uses a form of politics called legalism. It's extremely strict, harsh punishments. If you look at this painting here, you'll see it actually looks like all these look like Santa Clauses. But what's actually happening is that these scholars are being murdered because they disagree with the emperor, and all of their books are being burnt. Fast forward, people don't really like harsh punishments and torture. So what's going to happen is the Qin gets overthrown, and the Han dynasty will emerge because, again, the peasants don't like legalism. Also, peasants don't like paying high taxes. Keep this in mind. That and famine, these are things that they will rebel against you for. What they do is they create a new political system called Confucianism. This is also a religion. What they're going to do is mix this into their political structure to try to create social harmony and order through this idea of everybody actually playing their role in society, which means politicians need to actually learn about how to be a good politician. Some notable achievements of the Qin and the Han. The Qin dynasty is the one that created that unified China. They also built the Great Wall of China, the terracotta warriors, and the emperor, because he believed that drinking mercury would actually help you into the afterlife. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. It makes you die faster. But he's actually the one, too, that has that giant palace tomb that we can't really go in yet because there's so much mercury running through it. In the Han dynasty, they created bureaucracy. They also expanded their empires. They took more part of what will today be seen as China. And both of them actually centralize and standardize different things, whether they're law codes, the writing system, or forms of money. Before it was this standard circle with square, it was all sorts of different regional money. You have fish money, bell money, shell money, blade money, which to me seems super dangerous. But all of them centralize that to make people use the same method of communication, trade, to try to get them to identify as one China. They also use the Silk Roads for travel and for trade between them and the Middle East and Europe. That brings us to post-classical Chinese dynasties, ones that you read about very shortly, just a brief overview. The Sui dynasty, or Sui, I've been told it's pronounced both ways, so I have no idea. But they actually reunify China after the Han dynasty falls. There's more fighting, people are trying to get more power. So to reunify China, they build something called the Grand Canal. The Grand Canal is going to link China north and south, which allows them to trade better, to travel better, and again, to feel more of that unity. The Tang Dynasty is going to be the last one of our post-classical era. They're going to extend their boundaries again because it kind of shrank after the Han fell. They're also going to focus on bureaucracy and trade on the Silk Roads. And again, they're going to decline because angry peasants are mad at them, and also they're getting invaded from the north and the west, north being the Mongols. Yeah, so a lot of these are going to build up into the early modern era, which you will look at now. So first we're going to look at Japan. Japan has its own unique early history leading up into the early modern era. They have unique culture. It's a golden age in painting, literature. A lot of the paintings that you see or the scroll work that you see, woodblock art as well, a lot of that comes from that era. Their government actually was centralized but weakened, and so they end up in this feudal system where you have different families that are in charge. You have the shogun, you have the samurai are essentially kind of knights, and then the peasants at the bottom. They also experienced Chinese influence in different time periods, mostly things like form of dress, some of their written characters, and also their governing system. Korea has its own early history as well. You had these 3 different kingdoms that were competing for power, which is going to lead to China's ability to come in and take over until people try to kick out the Chinese and their influence. Vietnam is the one that actually resists Chinese influence the most. They're their own unique cultural group, and they actually end up maintaining most of their traditions and structure. They don't agree with the way that Chinese society works. They don't agree with how Chinese society in that period treated their women, and so Vietnam actually, for the most part, kind of rebelled against Chinese influence. All right, so that brings us up to speed with the early modern period for East Asia with the Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty is the first one that your AP test will likely focus on. So again, we're looking at the period of 1200 to 1450. The Song Dynasty was a smaller empire than the Tang. It actually ended up losing a lot of control because of nomads. Nomads, again, you've got the Mongols who are constantly attacking. They continue that Confucian system, that Confucianism through bureaucracy, something called meritocracy, where you can actually, even if you are a peasant, study, pass an exam, and become a politician, a bureaucrat. Still hard to do, though, if you are in the peasant class, because usually you're working in the fields, but basically means any person, any male, can be in the governing system, so allows movement. They also have something called the tribute system. The tribute system is a way to influence other regions and to gain their loyalty, specifically with Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. You read about kind of different ways in which they do this, but things that they will influence these groups with could be language, could be government, could be laws, or social practices. The Song dynasty is going to decline due to government corruption. Again, if your people are starving or if they're paying high taxes, they're going to be mad at you. And constant invasions, specifically the Mongols. If we look at them thematically, we've got social innovations and economy up here. Socially, the Song dynasty has something called a very strong patriarchy. Patriarchy is when males are actually, for the most part, dominant in society, and females are typically not necessarily oppressed, but they're not equal to their male counterparts. The scholar gentry is that system of meritocracy, right? You can study and take that test. You then are part of the scholar gentry. Doesn't matter if you were a peasant. If you pass the test, you now are part of the government, which is a way of changing your rank. And then in your middle class, you have your merchants, artisans, minor officials, and the largest class, you have the peasants. They also are early with urbanization, so building large cities, large dense populations living there. Not industrial yet, you don't have skyscrapers, but you're going to see a lot of people living in the same location. Their innovations, gunpowder. Gunpowder was initially thought to be the elixir of life. Then it was used for fireworks, and eventually it was used for guns, for weapons. The Mongols are going to actually take that, and they're going to introduce it to the Europeans, and that is how we end up with gunpowder in our weapons. Champa rice, drought resistant. Champa rice is very important. allows more stability in the food supply, so more people. Irrigation systems like the one that you see above this picture for rice. Movable type, which allows you not to have to rewrite everything over and over. You can actually just print it essentially. And junk ships, which are these giant ships I'll show you on the next slide. Economically, they have that Grand Canal. They're going to continue to reinforce that structure to use it. Also the Silk Roads, they're going to continue to use those for trade. Now they're trading via the sea using those junk ships. And again, they're going to continue with that tributary system. So just to kind of show you some of the things, the way that we know that there's patriarchy, right, is that typically, women are kept out of the law system, of the political system, and also aristocratic women, so noble women, from a young age were forced to bind their feet. What they would do is while the feet were growing, they would essentially wrap the foot so that it created this triangular shape. Eventually it grew into that shape. Here's an example of a shoe from an adult woman. And it was because this was a natural standard of beauty. Having tiny feet was seen as being beautiful, just as in some societies, having a tiny waist is seen as beautiful, or longer necks, or having perfect teeth, or things like that. Over here you can see movable type. All of these are little blocks, little pieces that represent Chinese characters. You could move them around, put ink on them, and then roll the paper over it, and that would allow you to very quickly essentially reprint something without having to write it. Here is a junk ship right here. It's so big that you actually could fit a giraffe in the bottom. These ships would go on kind of these trading journeys to try to open up trade with China to other places, and also to impress other countries, other communities. This ship right here, for reference, is one of Columbus's ships. And here's the Grand Canal going north-south. Again, connecting all these different places, creating unity, but also making sure people are able to trade and have food in all parts of China. Okay, so again, that's a brief overview of what you have been reading, looking at. Let's look at developments in Dar al-Islam, or the Islamic Empire. So before we get to the early modern period, it's essential to know a little bit about the origins of Islam. You first and foremost have Muhammad, who is the major prophet, one of the major figures of the creation of Islam. Muhammad, when he was actually a little bit older, went outside the city of Mecca, which is considered the holy city for Islam. And while he was meditating, he heard the voice of the angel Gabriel tell him that he is the last true prophet of God. The Arabic word for God is Allah, which also, interestingly enough, has no gender. It's not male or female, it just is. So in order to be a practicing Muslim, you have to follow the 5 pillars. Muhammad teaches these pillars. The first is faith, that he is the last true prophet. So again, if anyone else jumps up and is like, I'm Prophet Bob, you can be like, no, Bob, you are not a prophet. You are a fake. So Muhammad is the last true prophet, which means there have been other prophets before him. This religion accepts that, but he's the last addition, so to speak, of the word of God. You also have to believe that Allah is the one and only God, so that's the faith pillar. With prayer, you have to pray 5 times a day towards Mecca. With almsgiving, you have to give to the poor or those who are in need. There's a time period called Ramadan, which is the next pillar where you fast. Again, it's kind of a matching with Muhammad when he was fasting and meditating. And then there's the Hajj, which is a pilgrimage that once during your lifetime, if able, you do and go to the city of Mecca. And all of these tiny, it looks like television fuzz. All of these tiny little dots, these are people. Because each year they have to prepare Mecca for this pilgrimage, which is not just going to Mecca, getting off a plane and being like, cool, I did it. Instead, what you're actually doing is you're going on this journey that takes you through places that connect you to Muhammad, that connect you to Allah, that connect you to others of your faith. Before Muhammad died, he actually unified most of the Arabian Peninsula. So you see the Islamic religion and also the Islamic Empire spread through trade routes, spread through military conquest as it gets stronger. And it spreads through popularity. A lot of people want to be conquered by the Islamic Empire, and you can see all of its movements. It starts here under Muhammad, And then after Muhammad's death, the first rulers, this is the territory they add. Then you have the next set of territories. So again, you can see like the military campaigns as they cut through Africa, go over to Spain. But a lot of people liked being conquered by the Islamic Empire because they did not have to convert. They were not forced to convert into the religion, and oftentimes they had a better life under the Islamic Empire than they did from their own rulers, because the Islamic Empire was actually quite tolerant. This word egalitarian means equal. So basically, people were treated, for the most part, equally, or at least allowed to have religious freedom, and mostly this was a peaceful religion, peaceful takeover. You did have to pay a tax if you refused to convert, and you were considered not as high up in society. But again, people liked that rather than being forced to convert, for instance, like at gunpoint, essentially. So after Muhammad passes away, you have these leaders called caliphs or caliphs that take charge, but there's arguments over who should be the next leader, who should be the next caliph. This is going to split the Muslim world. Anytime a large, important leader dies, there's a power vacuum of sorts, and people are like, these are big shoes to fill, who's going to fill them? The two groups that you're going to see are the Sunni and the Shia. The Sunnis believe that the best qualified individual should lead, essentially. So you don't have to be a blood relative of Muhammad to lead. And the Shia believe that only those who are connected to Muhammad by blood should lead. Because of that, just as you see with divisions in other religions, there's going to be different levels of severity for different practices, different interpretations. The two groups are still part of the Islamic community, which is what the term Dar al-Islam refers to, but they just practice a little bit differently. That brings us to the Umayyad and Abbasid groups. The Umayyad dynasty, as you can see, before our modern era of 1200. What they're going to do is spread Islam to its height, so the largest that it's going to be. You can see that in green, and their capital is going to be in Damascus. The Abbasid dynasty is pretty much all we talk about with the Umayyad because it's not as long-lived. So we'll look at the Abbasid a little bit more. So their claim to fame, they spread the Islamic Empire. Now we have the Abbasid. So sorry. The Abbasid dynasty, they're going to be a little bit more longer-lived. They actually go into the 13th century, which is 1200. So they're going into that early modern period. They come to power after the Umayyad. They actually moved the capital to Baghdad, which is very important for you. Baghdad is going to be a very important city. It is a center of learning and trade, and this, during the Abbasid dynasty, is considered the golden age of learning for several reasons that you've read about, several reasons that you will see. Golden age in terms of science, mathematics, health innovations, as well as poetry, preservation of Greek works, all sorts of things. Without their work, we wouldn't have had the Renaissance. Both of these dynasties spread Islam further, and both of them were the Sunni branch of Islam. So remember again, there's Sunni Shia. These guys were Sunni. So looking at Dar al-Islam in 1200 under the Abbasids, they unfortunately suffer constant invasions, which is kind of, it makes sense because if you're centralized here, you're open to attacks from pretty much all sides, so they did have to deal with that a lot. However, as they expanded their territory, you'll notice they're by the Mediterranean Sea, they're by the Indian Ocean, they're actually by the Trans-Sahara trade route that we'll talk about. So these guys are able to trade a lot, which spreads their religion because ideas and religion spread via trade, just as things like spices do. Within the Abbasid dynasty, your social class is mostly based on your religion. So if you're upper class, that means you were born Muslim, probably on the Arabian Peninsula. If you're second class, you probably just converted to the Islamic religion. Or if you're third class, you are a protected status, but you are not Muslim. You are one of the protected groups that just has not converted. There's also, like we said before, this is the golden era of cultural achievements for the Islamic Empire. You have these centers of learning and trade like Baghdad, but also Cairo, for instance, Cordoba, Damascus, all over where the empire spreads out. They're going to be the ones that are responsible for the Renaissance because without them, we would have lost all these Greek works. and they're going to bring scholars together from all corners of the world, essentially, together in mathematics, looking at medicine, how to create a good hospital is one of the things that they're going to do, and also looking at philosophy. Economically, the Silk Roads are going to challenge Baghdad because Baghdad is kind of relying on people to come to them via, could be via the Mediterranean Sea, Indian Ocean, that sort of thing. They want people to come to them, but the Silk Roads make it easier to trade with other locations, so Baghdad kind of has all this competition. You do see a lot of trade of goods, technology, but again, religion, very important. And socially, the merchants are considered higher in status than in other places. China didn't really look at its merchants as being super important because for the longest time they were isolated from the rest of the world and trade. So merchants looked like kind of like they were only out to make money, not help society. Well, in the Islamic Empire, merchants help society by bringing different people in to help with education and such. So merchants are very important. When you look at slavery, slavery was allowed in the Islamic Empire, but you are not allowed to enslave other Muslims or people that are protected status. This led to a lot of people converting their religion, which then actually leads to them being free. Couple last things when we look at their social theme. Women. This is one thing that most people, I think, when you look at social groups during this time period, that most people for some reason don't actually know this, but women were actually celebrated in the Islamic Empire, and they actually had a higher status than those in China and their Christian and Jewish counterparts, because in their community, women were celebrated, could own property, could remarry if they were widows, they could actually divorce their husbands if they wanted to, sometimes they could have birth control or initiate that divorce themselves. Otherwise, they could still receive like money from their husband if they got a divorce. So women were actually part of like a protected group that Muhammad thought needed to be protected from the evils of men, actually, which is kind of why he celebrated all of his wives and tried to give them better rights. With the growth of towns and cities, you start to see more limitations, though, where women start to have more limited roles, and eventually you might see more strict leadership in groups that practice things like Sharia law. The last thing we're going to look at is the impact of the Islamic Empire. In Africa, you're going to look at the spread of Islam through trade, and you're going to see a lot of mixing, not just in architecture, like you can see over there, but also with languages. If you speak Arabic and they speak Bantu, well, you're going to have to mix your language and create a new one like Swahili. So you're going to see a lot of that, a lot of impact from the Islamic Empire in Africa, but also a lot of impact from Africa on the Islamic Empire. And last but not least, Spain. There's a lot of impact on Spain. This is typically called Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus is going to be an important center of learning. But the Islamic Empire rules Spain for the next 7 centuries. The capital is in Cordoba. And again, you still see this tolerance between Muslims, Christians, those of the Jewish faith. You still see a lot of trade, again, a lot of sea trade, a lot of waterways. And centers of learning like Al-Andalus, again, their work is going to inspire the Renaissance, scientific revolution, because to them, exploring science was honored. It wasn't going against religious beliefs, it was just exploring more of your world. They are going to be limited going into Europe, so if you can see, they kind of start to try to go a little bit farther north, but the Battle of Tours, Western Europe actually halts their expansion, and that's kind of the limit of the Islamic Empire's control. So that was a lot of information about East Asia and Dar al-Islam. It is stuff we've been talking about, though, so if any of that looks confusing, go back and kind of look back over some of your activities, some of your readings. Again, this was looking at East Asia before 1200, and then the main highlights of 1200, and then the same thing for Dar al-Islam. Thanks so much, guys, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.